He wanted to change the name from the Spinners to Philippé and the Spinners or something of that sort.
We find from the beginning, like with no hit records, that we had to come up with something different, you know, to be able to work. So we got the idea to try and be different from everybody else.
July 13th, 1984. Ivey's nightclub in Oakland, California. Philippé Wynne is midway through his set, dancing into the crowd the way he always did, that falsetto still soaring high enough to touch heaven. Then, without warning, he drops. Heart attack. Dead at 43. The voice that once topped the Billboard charts, the man who made Dionne Warwick sound even sweeter on Then Came You, gone before the ambulance even arrived.
There were a lot of women chasing them. I don't know how many caught them, but there are a lot chasing them.
But here's the thing folks don't talk about. Wynne didn't fade because the talent left. He faded because the industry, the ego, and the machine all collided at once. Back in '77, when the Spinners were still riding high, Wynne walked into a meeting and demanded they change the name to Philippé Wynne and the Spinners. The silence in that room said everything. He left, thinking he'd conquer the world solo. Instead, the world moved on without him. No hits, no headlines. Just a slow descent from sold-out arenas to small-town clubs, until that final night when his heart gave out under the stage lights. This is the story of the man whose voice lifted millions, but couldn't lift himself back up when the fall came.
I said, you without the Spinners won't work. If I were you, I wouldn't make that mistake.
That voice didn't come from nowhere. It came from the kind of pain most folks spend their whole lives trying to forget. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1941. Philip Walker entered the world on April 3rd, born into a home that wouldn't last. His parents divorced when he was too young to understand why, and before he could make sense of it, he was handed over to an orphanage. Not because they were dead, not because they couldn't be found, just because they couldn't keep him. Years later, in a 1981 interview, Wynne would say the hardest part wasn't the loneliness or the cold institutional walls. It was knowing both his parents were still alive, somewhere out there, living separate lives without him. That kind of abandonment doesn't just hurt. It burrows deep, finds a home in your chest, and stays there until you learn to sing it out. By 1956, 15-year-old Philip had had enough. He and his brother Michael ran away from that orphanage, caught a bus to Detroit, and went looking for the one thing that felt like home: music. They formed the Walker Singers, a gospel duo that played churches and community centers, pouring every ounce of that orphaned heartache into hymns and spirituals. Gospel didn't just teach Philip how to sing, it taught him how to testify, how to reach for something higher, how to turn pain into praise. Folks who heard him back then could feel it. That wasn't just talent. That was survival dressed up in melody. Detroit became his real education. By 1968, Philip was singing with Bootsy Collins' pacemakers, learning the funk, the groove, the rhythm that would later define his sound. He even spent a brief stint with James Brown's JBs, though anyone who worked for Brown knew that gig was equal parts glory and boot camp. Then came a curveball. In 1969, Philip became the lead singer of the Afro Kings, a group that took him all the way to Germany. He sang soul overseas, learned what it meant to be a showman, and came back to the States in 1971 with a voice that had been sharpened by distance and hunger. Then the phone rang. His cousin, G.C. Cameron, had just left the Spinners to go solo, and the group needed a new lead. They wanted someone with range, someone who could carry the gospel weight and still swing into R&B. They wanted Philip. By 1971, Philip Walker had sung gospel, funk, and soul across 2 continents. But it wasn't until he stepped into his cousin's spot with the Spinners that he finally found the one thing the orphanage never gave him: a family and a new name, Philippé Wynne. But family doesn't guarantee success. That takes something else: timing, luck, and a voice from heaven willing to vouch for you. By 1972, the Spinners were stuck. They'd been grinding with Motown for years, putting out solid tracks that barely scratched the charts. Then Aretha Franklin, the Queen herself, pulled them aside and gave them the advice that would change everything. Leave Motown, sign with Atlantic, and let a producer named Tom Bell work his magic. They listened. When they walked into Atlantic Studios in Philadelphia that year, Philippé Wynne didn't know he was about to record the song that would make him a star. The session was supposed to be routine. Tom Bell had them lay down "I'll Be Around" as a B-side, something to fill out the single, nothing more. But Wynne couldn't help himself. As the velvet strings swelled and the rhythm settled into that signature Philly groove, he started improvising, throwing in ad-libs, stretching syllables, letting that falsetto soar with little "oh yeahs" and "mm-hms" that felt more like a conversation than a vocal performance. Bell, sitting behind the glass with a cigarette burning in the ashtray, just nodded and let the tape roll. He knew what he was hearing: lightning in a bottle. Radio DJs flipped the record. The B-side became the A-side. By August 1972, "I'll Be Around" had climbed to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and hit number 1 on the R&B charts. Gold certification followed. Suddenly, the Spinners weren't just another group. They were the sound of black love, smooth and soulful, playing on every station from Harlem to Houston. At the center of it all was Philippé Wynne, his voice doing things most singers couldn't even imagine. They didn't waste the momentum. By November, "Could It Be I'm Falling in Love" hit number 4 on the pop charts and number 1 R&B, selling over 1 million copies. Then came "One of a Kind, Love Affair" in 1973, which peaked at number 11 on the Hot 100, with Wynne taking the solo lead. 3 massive hits in less than 2 years. The Spinners were headlining the Apollo, getting their name in lights, and Wynne's falsetto was becoming the signature sound of an entire era. Something was shifting, though. Wynne wasn't just singing anymore. He was leading. When you're the one the crowd screams for, when you're the voice people remember long after the song ends, it's hard not to start thinking of yourself as more than just 1/5 of a group. 3 hits in a row. Gold records on the wall. Philippé Wynne's falsetto ringing out from car radios across the country. Success has a way of making you forget you're part of a group and remembering you've got a voice all your own. And that voice kept rising. 1974 was supposed to be just another year of hits. But when Atlantic paired the Spinners with Dionne Warwick for "Then Came You," something historic happened. The single shot straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The first chart topper for both Warwick and the Spinners. Wynne's falsetto locked in perfect harmony with Warwick's alto, creating a duet that felt effortless, romantic, untouchable. In the control room, producers watched the tape reels spin and knew they had lightning again. The song became inescapable, playing at weddings, on late-night slow dance floors, in the cars of couples who thought love might actually last forever. The momentum didn't stop. The Mighty Love album dropped that same year and spawned 3 top 20 R&B hits, solidifying the Spinners as one of the most consistent acts in soul music. Then came 1975, and "Games People Play" climbed to number 5 on the Hot 100 and hit number 1 R&B. Every release felt like a guarantee. Radio knew what to expect. Fans knew what they were getting, and Philippé Wynne knew he was the reason people were listening. By 1976, they were untouchable. The Rubber Band Man became their signature, a funky, playful number that peaked at number 2 on the Hot 100 and number 1 R&B, earning another gold certification. The music video showed Wynne front and center, dancing with exaggerated elastic movements, his energy magnetic, his presence undeniable. It was the last major hit he would ever have with the Spinners. But nobody knew that yet. Behind the scenes, something was shifting. Wynne had always been confident, but confidence was starting to curdle into something else. He'd linger after rehearsals, talking about solo opportunities, dropping hints about how much more he could do if he had full creative control. On tour buses late at night, while the rest of the group played cards or slept, Wynne sat alone, scribbling ideas, imagining album covers with his name, just his name, in bold letters across the front. Bobby Smith, the other co-lead singer, started noticing the distance. Years later, he'd put it plainly. We looked at it actually he was being cocky. Maybe cocky was the right word. Or maybe it was just hunger. Wynne had spent his childhood abandoned, his teenage years chasing validation through gospel, and his 20s grinding in funk bands across 2 continents. Now, finally, he had everything. The hits, the applause, the respect. But he didn't just want to be part of the sound. He wanted to be the sound. So he started floating the idea to anyone who would listen. Rename the group. Make it official. Call it Philippé Wynne and the Spinners. The rest of the group heard him, but they didn't agree. By the end of 1976, the Spinners had sold millions. Philippé Wynne wasn't thinking about we anymore. He was thinking about I. And in January 1977, he walked into a meeting ready to make that official. The air in that Detroit room was thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken tension. January 1977. The Spinners sat around a table: Bobby Smith, Henry Fambrough, Purvis Jackson, Billy Henderson, waiting to hear what Philippé Wynne had called them together to say. They'd been riding high for 5 years straight, gold records stacked up, fans screaming their names from coast to coast. But Wynne had something on his mind, something he'd been turning over for months. When he finally said it out loud, the room went cold. He wanted the group renamed Philippé Wynne and the Spinners. Silence, the kind that feels heavier than any argument. Bobby Smith stared at him, trying to figure out if this was a negotiation or an ultimatum. Henry Fambrough, the elder statesman of the group, just shook his head slowly, like he'd seen this coming but hoped it wouldn't arrive so soon. Nobody shouted. Nobody threw chairs. They just sat there, letting the weight of what Wynne was asking settle into the spaces between them. Because what he was really asking for wasn't just a name change. It was a hierarchy, a crown, a way of saying, I'm the reason you're here. Maybe, in some ways, he believed that. Wynne had poured everything into those records, his falsetto carrying hit after hit, his ad-libs becoming the moments fans rewound their tapes to hear again. But the Spinners had been a group long before he arrived, and they planned to be a group long after. So they said no, not with anger, just with finality. Wynne stood up. He didn't slam the door on his way out, but he didn't need to. The decision was made. Years later, Henry Fambrough would tell people that Wynne left to pursue spiritual work, a gentler spin on what was really a rupture born from ego and ambition. Bobby Smith would be more direct, saying Wynne had gotten cocky, that the success had made him forget where he came from. Both stories were true. Both stories were incomplete. Within weeks, Wynne signed a solo deal with Cotillion Records, bringing in Alan Thicke. Yes, that Alan Thicke, the actor and TV personality, as his manager. It felt big. It felt like validation. Meanwhile, the Spinners called in John Edwards to take over lead duties, and without missing a beat, they kept recording, kept touring, kept thriving. The machine didn't stop. It just replaced the part that walked away. Philippé Wynne walked out of that room believing the world would follow him. The Spinners kept singing, and for the first time in 5 years, Wynne was on his own. It didn't take long for the dream to crack. Wynne was in the studio at Cotillion Records, laying down tracks for his debut solo album, Starting All Over. The title felt like a promise, a declaration that he was ready to rebuild from the ground up. He poured himself into every session, reaching for the same falsetto magic that had carried the Spinners to gold. The label executive sat in the back of the playback room, arms crossed, nodding politely as the mixes played through the monitors. But there's a difference between polite and excited. Wynne could feel it in the silence that followed each song. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for another take. It just waits for the session to end. The lead single, Take Me As I Am, dropped later that year. It climbed to number 62 on the R&B charts and stopped. No crossover, no buzz, no second single. By the time the dust settled, Cotillion had quietly dropped him from the roster, and Starting All Over became the album nobody talked about. Meanwhile, back in Detroit, the Spinners released Heaven on Earth, with John Edwards on lead vocals. It peaked at number 5 on the Hot 100. The message was clear. They didn't need Wynne. But Wynne, he needed them more than he'd ever admit. 2 years passed, like a slow bleed. Wynne hustled, took session work, stayed on the edges of the industry, waiting for the next break. In 1979, it came. George Clinton, the architect of the P-Funk empire, invited Wynne to join Parliament Funkadelic. It felt like salvation. Clinton had a knack for taking discarded talent and turning them into funk legends. And when Wynne stepped up to the mic for Not Just Knee Deep, everything clicked. The song hit number 1 on the R&B charts, a massive smash that reminded the world what Philippé Wynne's voice could do. For a moment, it felt like the comeback was real, like maybe walking away from the Spinners hadn't been a mistake after all. But comebacks don't last on one song. In 1980, Wynne released Wynne Jammin' on George Clinton's Uncle Jam label, hoping to ride the momentum. The album stalled at number 81 on the R&B charts. No hits, no tours, no follow-up. Clinton moved on to the next project, and Wynne was left standing in the same place he'd been before, talented, hungry, and invisible. He even started his own publishing company and label, trying to take control of the one thing the industry kept denying him: ownership. But without distribution, without radio, without the machine behind you, ownership doesn't mean much. It's one thing to walk away from a group. It's another thing entirely to make people care when you're standing alone. One number 1 R&B hit with George Clinton couldn't undo the truth. The industry had moved on. And Philippé Wynne, the voice that once topped the pop charts, was now chasing gigs just to stay in the game. So he kept singing. Because what else was there? The early 80s were a blur of small stages and smaller paychecks. In 1981, Wynne landed a feature on Gene Dunlap's Something Inside My Head, a track that climbed to number 61 on the R&B charts. Not a hit, but enough to keep his name circulating among those who still remembered. 3 years later, he released what would be his final album, a self-titled record on Sugar Hill Records. The lead single, You Ain't Going Anywhere But Gone, peaked at number 54 R&B. It wasn't the comeback he'd dreamed of. It was just another reminder that the world had moved on. But Wynne hadn't. He was still married to Ava LaFleur, the woman he'd wed in a Vegas ceremony back in 1973, when the Spinners were at their peak and the future still felt wide open. They'd moved to California after he left the group, trying to build something stable, something resembling a life outside the spotlight. He had a family now, responsibilities, bills, and singing, even in half-empty nightclubs, was still the only thing he knew how to do. So, he worked the circuit, regional shows, nightclubs, the kind of venues where the bartender knew your name and the crowd was there more for the drinks than the performance. Places like Ivey's in Oakland became regular stops, spots where Wynne could still command a stage, still hit those high notes, still make people feel something even if they didn't remember his name. No interviews, no magazine profiles, no press coverage from the outlets that used to call him for quotes. Just a man with a voice that used to matter, singing to rooms that were smaller than they should have been. But he never stopped believing. That's the thing folks don't understand about performers like Wynne. The hope doesn't die just because the hits do. Every gig felt like it could be the one that got him back. Every stage felt like it could lead somewhere bigger. and in the summer of 1984, at 43 years old, he was still chasing it. On July 13th, he walked onto the stage at Ivey's nightclub in Oakland. He had no idea it would be the last time. The lights at Ivey's were dim, the kind of low amber glow that softened the edges of a room that had seen better decades. July 13th, 1984, Saturday night. Wynne took the stage like he always did, with confidence, with that same hunger to connect, to make people feel something. The crowd was small but engaged, swaying to the rhythm as he moved through his set, hitting those falsetto notes that still carried the ghost of Philly soul's golden era. For a moment, it didn't matter that the hits had stopped coming, that the industry had forgotten his name. In that room, under those lights, Philippé Wynne was still somebody. Midway through the encore, he did what he'd always done. He stepped off the stage and danced into the crowd. It was his signature move, the thing that made people feel like they weren't just watching a show. They were part of it. He moved between tables, grinning, improvising, letting the music carry him. Then, without warning, he collapsed. The music stopped. Someone screamed. People rushed forward, hands reaching, voices calling his name. But Wynne didn't get back up. His heart had given out, right there in the middle of the performance, in the middle of the life he'd been fighting so hard to hold on to. Paramedics arrived, but it was too late. By the next day, July 14th, 1984, Philippé Wynne was gone, 43 years old. The New York Times ran a brief obituary confirming the cause of death as a heart attack. No autopsy details, no toxicology reports, just the clinical facts. A singer, best known for his work with the Spinners, had died on stage in Oakland. The funeral was small, quiet. Most of the industry figures who'd praised him a decade earlier didn't show. The headlines that should have celebrated his legacy never came. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Not for a voice that had topped the Billboard Hot 100. Not for a man who'd turned B-sides into gold records. Not for someone who'd sung with Dionne Warwick and George Clinton and made millions of people feel something real. But the cruel math of fame doesn't care about talent. It only cares about timing. And Wynne's time had run out long before his heart did. The voice that once soared to #1 on the Billboard charts went silent in a nightclub in Oakland. No headlines, no tributes, just a small obituary in the New York Times and a funeral that felt emptier than it should have. But death doesn't always mean the story ends. For Ava and the family Wynne left behind, the silence after 1984 was deafening. Then, 15 years later, tragedy struck again. In 1999, one of Wynne's sons was killed in a shooting. 2 years after that, in 2001, another son drowned. The man who'd sung about love and heartbreak for millions of strangers had left behind a family that would carry losses too heavy for any song to hold. His widow rarely spoke publicly. His children's stories stayed private. And for decades, Philippé Wynne's name faded from the collective memory of soul music, buried beneath the hits that kept playing without him. But the music didn't forget. The Spinners songs, I'll Be Around, Could It Be I'm Falling in Love, The Rubber Band Man, kept streaming, kept playing at weddings and cookouts and late-night drives. Millions of listens, millions of moments. And somewhere in those falsetto runs, in those improvised ad-libs, Wynne's voice was still doing the work. Tom Bell, the producer who'd captured that magic back in 1972, would later credit Wynne as the spark that lit the whole Philly soul era on fire. But most casual listeners didn't know his name. They just knew the feeling. Then, in 2023, nearly 40 years after his death, Philippé Wynne was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame alongside the Spinners. It was the recognition he'd chased his whole life, the validation that said, you mattered. By then, YouTube had become a digital archive of his genius. Clips of his live performances, indie documentaries piecing together his story, comment sections filled with people discovering him for the first time. "Why didn't I know about this man?" they'd write. "This voice is everything." Philippé Wynne didn't die forgotten because he lacked talent. He died forgotten because the world only has room for so many voices at the top. And when you step away, even for a second, the microphone gets handed to someone else. But if you listen close, you can still hear him. In every spinner's song, in every gospel run, in every falsetto that dares to reach a little higher. He's still there, soaring,